My name is Alara Whitmore, and the first thing I ever built entirely for myself was a house no one believed I was capable of owning. It wasn't large. It wasn't extravagant. It didn't sit on acres of land or overlook a dramatic skyline. But it was mine, purchased with years of careful budgeting, late shifts, disciplined choices, and the quiet determination of someone who had grown up knowing she would never be rescued. I hadn't told my family. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted, for once, to experience something that wasn't immediately inspected, evaluated, or quietly reassigned. The house sat at the edge of Alder Creek, a small town where old maple trees leaned over the sidewalks like watchful elders. The backyard was simple, just enough space for a dog to run, bordered by thick hedges that created a kind of gentle privacy. When I first stepped through the open gate during the viewing, I remember feeling something settle inside my chest. Not excitement. Not pride. Something steadier. Recognition. Like I had finally found a space that would not demand I shrink. Growing up, I learned very early that roles are rarely announced, they're absorbed. My older sister, Marissa, was always described as sensitive. Sensitive to criticism. Sensitive to stress. Sensitive to responsibility. My mother would say it with concern woven into her voice, as if the world itself had been especially unkind to her. She feels things more deeply than you do, Alara. That sentence followed me through childhood like a quiet verdict. If Marissa forgot homework, my mother called the teacher. If Marissa argued with friends, my mother mediated. If Marissa quit a job after 2 weeks because it felt wrong, my parents absorbed the financial strain without question. When I asked why the rules were different, the answer was always calm, reasonable, final. You're strong. You don't need as much help. It sounded like praise. It wasn't. It was an assignment. My father rarely challenged it. He preferred peace over fairness. He would sit at the dinner table in silence while decisions were made around him, nodding faintly when my mother justified another exception. And so I adapted. I didn't ask for spending money, I worked. I didn't ask for tuition help, I found scholarships. I didn't ask for furniture, I bought secondhand and refinished it at night. Independence wasn't something I chose. It was something that was expected of me. And over time, I stopped sharing my achievements because celebration felt dangerous. If I seemed too proud, it was interpreted as showing off. If I succeeded too loudly, it risked casting an uncomfortable shadow. So I learned to move quietly. I worked at a small veterinary clinic in Alder Creek. The building smelled faintly of antiseptic and dog shampoo, and I knew every creak in the hallway floors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Animals didn't expect you to dim yourself for their comfort. My dog, Rufus, came to work with me most days. A mixed-breed rescue with thoughtful eyes and ears that folded like soft paper. He stayed near my desk, resting his chin on my shoe whenever the clinic grew loud. It was during one of those steady, ordinary weeks that the idea of a house stopped feeling distant. My apartment felt temporary, like I was still waiting for permission to settle. I began browsing listings without telling anyone. Not even my best friend, Nina. I drove through neighborhoods on quiet evenings, watching how the light hit front porches. I wasn't searching for perfection. I was searching for alignment. And then I found it. A modest house tucked near the edge of town. White siding slightly weathered. Wooden steps leading to a small porch. The yard wasn't manicured, it felt natural, lived in. When Rufus stepped into the backyard during the viewing, he ran one slow circle and then stopped in the center, looking at me as if to say, "This is safe." Inside, sunlight spilled across hardwood floors in wide, forgiving shapes. The rooms were balanced, not cramped, not echoing. I could see my mornings there. Coffee steaming by the kitchen window. Shoes by the door exactly where I left them. Silence that belonged to me. The decision didn't feel impulsive. It felt inevitable. The paperwork was exhausting but grounding. I gathered bank statements, pay stubs, tax records, evidence of every quiet sacrifice I'd made. When the mortgage was approved, I sat in my car afterward and cried. Not dramatically, just quietly. Because for the first time, something in my life hadn't been negotiated by anyone else. The down payment came entirely from my savings, money built from skipped vacations, overtime shifts, and years of saying no when it would have been easier to say yes. I moved in slowly. The kitchen table was second-hand. I sanded and refinished it myself in the evenings, the smell of varnish mixing with soft music playing in the background. I chose linen curtains that diffused the afternoon sun. I placed Rufus's bed near the back door so he could watch the yard. Every object had intention. Nothing was inherited. Nothing was imposed. I didn't tell my family because I wanted to experience one full moment in my life that wasn't open for commentary. 4 months, the house was peaceful. I swept the floors each night, trimmed the hedges, wiped down windows until sunlight moved through them clearly. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was restorative. I began to understand something subtle. A home is not just shelter. It is proof of self-trust. The first boundary was crossed on a Wednesday afternoon. I had just returned from work and was making tea when the doorbell began ringing, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Sharp. Insistent. I checked the camera on my phone. My parents stood on the porch. Marissa stood between them. They weren't smiling. They weren't confused. They looked certain. I opened the door out of instinct more than invitation. They walked in without waiting. My mother began inspecting the kitchen cabinets as if evaluating storage space. My father surveyed the living room with narrowed eyes, calculating improvements. Marissa stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. Not with admiration. With assessment. "This layout works," she said calmly. "I can make this work." My stomach tightened. "For what?" I asked. She glanced at me, faint amusement flickering across her face. "For me. I'll move in this weekend." It wasn't phrased as a request. It was delivered like a conclusion already approved by a committee I hadn't attended. I felt something old rise inside me, the familiar instinct to remain calm, to not appear dramatic. "This isn't a shared property," I said carefully. "I bought this house for myself." My mother smiled in the way she does when she believes a child doesn't understand something obvious. "Ilara," she said softly, "Marissa needs stability right now. You have space. It only makes sense." My father didn't speak. He rarely did when decisions favored her. Marissa walked down the hallway, opening the second bedroom door and lingering there. "This one will be perfect for my office," she said, already imagining it. I felt the walls of my own home begin to narrow. "This isn't up for discussion," I said, keeping my voice level. Marissa laughed lightly. "You're overreacting." Then, as they prepared to leave, she paused near the entryway hooks where I kept a spare key. She picked one up, slid it into her bag. "I'll bring my things Saturday," she said. And they walked out. No argument. No acknowledgement. No permission requested. The house felt altered the moment the door closed. Not physically, but energetically. Like someone had stepped across an invisible line and left footprints behind. That night, I didn't cry. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood I had refinished with my own hands. For the first time in years, I didn't feel assigned. I felt aware. And something inside me, something quiet but unwavering, began to form. The moving truck arrived on Friday. Not Saturday. Friday. I saw it before I even turned into my driveway, a white rental truck idling along the curb, its back doors rolled open like a mouth already mid-sentence. For a moment, I simply sat in my car with the engine running. Rufus shifted in the passenger seat, sensing the change in my breathing. I had known this would happen. I had told myself I was prepared. But preparation feels theoretical until you see strangers lifting furniture toward your front door. Marissa stood in the driveway directing two movers. She wore sunglasses despite the cloudy sky, arms crossed, posture relaxed, like someone overseeing renovations in her own home. My home. When she saw my car, she lifted one hand in a small, casual wave. As if I had just returned from work to a normal afternoon. As if this had been agreed upon. I stepped out of the car slowly, closing the door with deliberate calm. "What is this?" I asked, even though the answer stood stacked in cardboard boxes behind her. She lowered her sunglasses. "I told you I'd move in this weekend. I figured earlier is better. The guys are on an hourly rate." Her tone was mildly inconvenienced, as though I had asked an unnecessary question. "You don't live here," I said. Marissa smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with the patient amusement of someone indulging a child. "Elara," she said gently, "we've already talked about this. Mom agrees. Dad agrees. It makes sense." There it was again. Consensus. Approval. A decision made in a circle that did not include me. The movers stepped past us with a vanity table between them. I moved instinctively toward the door. "You need to stop," I said, this time louder. Clearer. Marissa didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "You always do this," she replied. "You get territorial about things that should be shared." Territorial. As if I were guarding something unreasonable. As if boundaries were greed. She pulled the spare key from her bag, the one she had taken without asking, and unlocked the door. And just like that, my house was open to her. By the time I stepped inside, the living room had already begun to shift. The couch had been moved slightly to the left. My coffee table angled differently. Two of her boxes lined the hallway. It was subtle. But it felt violent. The space no longer moved with my rhythm. It felt interrupted, like someone had changed the tempo of a song without warning. Marissa walked into the second bedroom and opened the windows. "I'll need better lighting in here," she called out. "And we might repaint." "We." I stood in the doorway. "There is no we." She turned, studying me. "Why are you making this so dramatic?" The old script again. If I objected, I was dramatic. If I resisted, I was difficult. If I protected, I was selfish. "I bought this house," I said quietly. "With my money. My credit. My savings. You don't get to move in because it's convenient." She crossed her arms. "Convenient?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "I just lost my lease because my landlord sold the building. I'm under stress. You have extra space. Family helps family. Family respects family," I replied. That landed. Not explosively. But enough for her expression to flicker. For a brief second, the mask slipped and I saw something else beneath it. Not fragility. Entitlement. "You've always thought you were better than me," she said softly. It wasn't true. But it was powerful. Because it reframed the situation, shifted it from invasion to accusation. "I've never thought that," I said. "I just don't want to disappear inside my own life anymore." Silence hung between us. Then she turned away and began unpacking clothes onto the bed. Conversation over. Decision made. By her. That evening, after the movers left and the house felt unfamiliar, I called Nina. She arrived within 20 minutes, no questions asked. We sat at my kitchen table, my table, while Rufus rested his head on my knee. I explained everything. The key. The truck. The rearranged furniture. The way my mother had framed it as reasonable. Nina didn't interrupt. She let the silence build until I had said it all. Then she asked one question. If you let this happen, what does your life look like in 5 years? I didn't answer immediately. But I saw it. Marissa's preferences dictating shared spaces. My schedule bending around her needs. My parents using my house as neutral ground for their conflicts. Every decision negotiated. Every boundary softened. The house becoming another version of my childhood. You won't just be sharing space, Nina said gently. You'll be giving up the only place you ever chose for yourself. Her words didn't ignite rage. They ignited clarity. I had spent my entire life adapting to keep peace. But peace without respect isn't peace. It's erasure. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I could hear Marissa moving down the hall, drawers opening, closet doors sliding. The sounds were small, but they were invasive. My house no longer felt like an extension of my breath. It felt negotiated. And suddenly I understood something I had never fully accepted. No one was going to protect my boundaries for me. Not my father. Not my mother. Not even Marissa. If I didn't draw the line, it would not exist. The decision formed slowly, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. I would not argue. I would not debate. I would not seek approval. I would act. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. Marissa was still asleep in the second bedroom. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the pale light stretch across the backyard. Rufus leaned against my leg. I won't lose this, I whispered, not to him, but to myself. By 8 a.m., I had the number for a locksmith saved in my phone. By 9 a.m., I had scheduled an appointment. By noon, the locks would be replaced. And by the time Marissa returned from whatever errand she planned that afternoon, she would no longer have access to my life. The locksmith arrived at 11:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was standing in the hallway when his van pulled into the driveway, and my heart was beating so loudly I thought he might hear it through the door. Marissa had left an hour earlier. She said she needed coffee and a few things from storage. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't tell me when she'd be back. She moved through my house like someone who had already secured ownership. The locksmith was middle-aged, quiet, efficient. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't look around curiously. I need all exterior locks changed, I told him. Front, back, garage. He nodded once and unpacked his tools. I stood nearby while he removed the first lock. When the old mechanism slipped free from the door, something inside my chest loosened with it. The metal clinked into his tray, small, final. For years I had confused endurance with maturity. But endurance is not the same as consent. The new lock clicked into place. Solid. Certain. He handed me 2 fresh keys when he finished. These are the only copies, he said. Good, I replied. When he drove away, the house felt different. Not tense. Not anxious. Still. Like it was holding its breath with me. I didn't stop there. If I hesitated, doubt would creep in. Doubt had been trained into me since childhood, a reflex that asked, "Are you being unfair? Are you overreacting?" So I moved quickly. I called a local hauling company and requested same-day pickup. When they arrived, I directed them to everything Marissa had brought in. The vanity table. The suitcases. The clothing folded across the second bed. Her makeup bottles lined up on my dining table like small territorial flags. Each item was carried out without ceremony. The workers didn't ask whose things they were. They didn't need to. They were just objects. And objects do not get to decide where they belong. I watched from the porch as the final box disappeared into the truck. There was no anger in me. Only a strange calm. The second bedroom returned to its original state, empty, quiet, waiting. I rearranged my living room exactly how it had been before she shifted it. Couch centered. Coffee table aligned. Rug straightened. Restoration is a quiet kind of power. By the time I finished, the house felt like it recognized me again. She returned Sunday at noon. The sky was heavy and gray, the air thick and unmoving. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard tires crunch against gravel. Rufus lifted his head. Then came the first twist of the door handle. A sharp pause. Another twist. Harder this time. The door did not open. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a failed expectation. It lasted 3 seconds. Then came the pounding. Ilara. Marissa's voice cut through the door. What is this? I remained seated. My hands continued folding a towel slowly, deliberately. The pounding grew louder. This isn't funny. Open the door. Her voice shifted, disbelief sliding into anger. She tried the handle again. Rattled it. Ilara. I stood and walked into the hallway, stopping just out of sight from the small window beside the door. I didn't want to see her face. I didn't need to. This is ridiculous, she shouted. You changed the locks. Yes. Yes, I answered calmly through the door. There was a stunned pause. You can't do that. I already did. More pounding. You threw my things out. They're no longer here. Her breathing grew heavier, not crying, not yet, but wounded pride mixed with fury. You're selfish, she said. After everything this family has done for you. I almost laughed at that. What had they done for me? Assigned me strength so they could excuse her dependence. Confused my independence for endless capacity. This is my house, I said, voice steady. You don't live here. You're my sister, and that does not give you keys to my life. Silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't confusion. It was realization. She was not getting in. My phone began vibrating almost immediately. First my mother. Then my father. Then a group call. I let it ring twice before answering my mother. Her voice was sharp, breathless. What have you done? I changed my locks. You embarrassed your sister. She's standing outside like a stranger. She is a stranger to this house. How could you be so cold? My mother demanded. She's under stress. I have been under pressure my entire life, I replied quietly. And no one rearranged the world for me. My father's voice entered the call. You're being dramatic. There it was again. The word they used whenever I refused to comply. I am being clear, I corrected. You owe your sister support, my mother insisted. I do not owe anyone my home. The line went silent. Not because they understood, but because they had run out of script. Finally, I said the only sentence that mattered. This is my house. She does not live here. And I hung up. Outside, the pounding had stopped. Through the thin wood of the door, I could hear Marissa pacing. Then a frustrated exhale. Then footsteps retreating. A car door slammed. The engine roared louder than necessary, a performance even in defeat. Then she was gone. The street returned to stillness. I locked the deadbolt gently, even though it was already locked. Not out of fear. Out of finality. Rufus came to stand beside me, pressing his side against my leg. The house was quiet again. Not tense. Not invaded. Quiet. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty for protecting myself. I felt awake. The house stayed quiet after Marissa drove away. But the world outside it did not. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with notifications I hadn't yet muted. I didn't need to open them to know what they were. Marissa had always preferred an audience when things didn't go her way. I waited until evening before looking. Her post was long. Emotional. Carefully phrased. She wrote about betrayal. about being locked out of her own sister's home, about how she had been left without support during a difficult time. She didn't mention the spare key she took. She didn't mention the moving truck. She didn't mention that I had said no. She framed it as abandonment, as cruelty, as cold ambition over family loyalty. The comments came quickly. Some people offered sympathy. Some asked questions. A few people who knew her more closely stayed quiet. I read it once. Then I blocked her. Not angrily. Just decisively. Then I blocked my mother. Then my father. Then the extended family group chat. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like isolation. It felt like control. News travels in small towns, even when you don't participate in it. I didn't ask for updates, but they reached me anyway, through Nina, through acquaintances, through the quiet edges of social circles that overlap whether you invite them to or not. Marissa's post had not landed the way she expected. A few of her co-workers had seen it. One recognized the pattern, the way she described herself as displaced while avoiding responsibility. Another mentioned how often she left work early claiming emotional overwhelm. Her supervisor called her in. What began as concern turned into documentation. Within a week, she was asked to leave the company. Officially, it was framed as performance issues. Unofficially, people were tired of rearranging themselves around her. When I heard that, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something more complicated. Not pity. Not triumph. Recognition. Consequences had finally reached her without my intervention. My mother called from a number I didn't recognize 2 days later. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was restrained but strained. "Ilara, this has gone too far. Your sister lost her job. She's under immense pressure. We need to talk like adults." Like adults. The irony sat heavily in my chest. Talking like adults had never included my boundaries before. It had always meant agreeing. Another message came from my father. "You're dividing the family." No. I wasn't dividing anything. I was refusing to be absorbed. Through Nina, I learned more. Marissa's lease had truly fallen through, but not without warning. She had ignored notices. Missed deadlines. Assumed something would work out. It always had before. My parents stepped in financially, as they always did. They paid down her overdue credit card balance. They helped with temporary housing. They sold my father's fishing boat, the one he'd had since I was a teenager, to cover part of it. That detail landed differently. Not because I felt guilty, but because I realized something had shifted. For the first time, my parents were paying for her choices without transferring the cost onto me. I was no longer the convenient solution. A week later, my aunt called. Not to accuse. To mediate. She said families shouldn't fracture over pride. She suggested compromise, maybe letting Marissa stay just for a few months. Maybe drafting a simple agreement. Her tone was gentle, reasonable. The kind that makes you question your own resolve. I listened quietly. Then I asked her one question. If this were your house, bought with your savings, would you feel obligated? There was a pause on the line. Long enough. I suppose not, she admitted. Then why is it different for me? She didn't have an answer. Because there wasn't one. The strangest part wasn't the backlash. It was the calm. Every morning, I woke up and the house felt exactly as it had before, undisturbed, aligned, steady. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors. Rufus waited by the back door for his walk. The kitchen table held only what I placed on it. There were no passive comments about repainting walls. No sighs about shared space. No subtle reshaping of my life to fit someone else's comfort. I realized something slowly. The guilt I had expected never arrived. Not because I was heartless, but because I had done nothing wrong. Boundaries feel harsh only to those who benefited from your lack of them. That truth settled into me like foundation. 2 weeks after the lock change, Marissa made one final attempt. She sent a handwritten letter. It arrived in my mailbox without a return address. Inside, her handwriting was careful, almost delicate. She wrote that she felt betrayed. That she had always believed we would have each other. That I had humiliated her publicly. That I had turned my back when she needed stability. She ended with, "I don't recognize you anymore." I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Because she was right about one thing. She didn't recognize me. The version of me she knew had been quieter. More accommodating. More willing to disappear. That version no longer lived here. Life resumed its rhythm. Work at the clinic. Evening walks. Coffee in my kitchen without tension in my shoulders. Occasionally, I would pass places in town where I knew my family might be. I didn't detour. I didn't hide. I simply continued. And something subtle but powerful had changed. I no longer felt responsible for managing their comfort. That had been my unspoken role for years. Now, I was only responsible for myself. The house stood unchanged. White siding catching the afternoon light. Hedges swaying softly in the breeze. It was still modest. Still simple. But it held something it hadn't fully held before. Finality. And peace. Earned peace. It happened 3 months later. Not a phone call. Not a message from an unknown number. A knock. Slow. Heavy. Certain. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. Rufus lifted his head first, ears alert but not barking. The knock came again, measured, deliberate. I knew who it was before I reached the door. Some instincts don't fade. Through the frosted glass, I saw 2 silhouettes. My parents. Together. They had never come together before. For years, it had been one or the other, whichever role suited the situation. My mother, emotional and wounded. My father, stern and practical. Seeing them side by side felt different. Strategic. I opened the door. But I didn't step back. My mother looked thinner. My father older. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest strain. "Ilara," my mother said, her voice soft, almost careful. "Mom." My father nodded once. "Can we come in?" The old reflex stirred inside me. Hospitality. Compliance. Avoidance of conflict. I let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it. "We can talk here," I said. The air outside was cool. A light wind moved through the trees. It wasn't hostile, just honest. My mother swallowed. "We don't want to fight." "That's new," I replied calmly. My father shifted slightly. "Your sister is struggling." I didn't react. "She's staying with us," my mother continued. "It's been difficult." Of course it had. When Marissa couldn't expand into my space, she collapsed back into theirs. And now they were feeling what I had refused. "She lost another job," my father said. There were issues. There were always issues. My mother's eyes glistened, but I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Exhaustion. Real exhaustion. "We're not asking you to take her in," she said quickly, as if afraid I'd close the door. That surprised me. "Then why are you here?" I asked. My father hesitated. Because this wasn't about logistics. It was about balance. For decades, the emotional equation of this family had been uneven. Marissa consumed. I compensated. Now the system had collapsed. And they didn't know how to stabilize it. My mother's voice lowered. "She says you've changed." I held her gaze steadily. "I have." Silence. The wind moved between us. "You're colder," my father said. "No," I answered quietly. "I'm clearer." That word seemed to land. Clearer. Not cruel. Not vindictive. Clear. My mother exhaled slowly. "We didn't realize how much pressure we were putting on you." That sentence almost cracked something inside me. Almost. Because acknowledgement is powerful, but it doesn't erase history. "I wasn't pressured," I said. "I was expected." Neither of them argued. And that told me everything. My father looked at the house behind me. "We thought you were strong enough." There it was. The justification. Strength as a reason to assign burden. "I was," I said. "That doesn't mean I should have carried her." My mother's eyes dropped. "She says you abandoned her." "She abandoned responsibility," I replied evenly. The quiet that followed wasn't defensive. It was reflective. That was new. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being corrected. I wasn't being told to understand her side. I wasn't being asked to bend. They were listening. Not fully agreeing, but listening. My mother surprised me next. "Are you happy?" It wasn't accusatory. It was uncertain. And maybe a little afraid of the answer. "Yes," I said. The word came without hesitation. Because it was true. Not ecstatic. Not triumphant. But steady. Peaceful. Self-contained. My father nodded slowly. "That's something," he murmured. They stood there for another moment, as if waiting for something dramatic to happen. For tears. For reconciliation. For me to soften and say I missed them. But real change is quiet. "I don't hate her," I said finally. "Or you." My mother looked relieved. "But I won't carry what isn't mine anymore." That part stayed firm. My father extended his hand slightly, not to shake, just a subtle gesture of truce. "We're trying to figure things out," he admitted. That sentence might have been the most honest thing he had ever said to me. And I realized something then. They hadn't come to demand. They had come because the old structure no longer worked. And they didn't know who they were without it. They didn't ask to come inside again. They didn't argue. They didn't push. When they walked back to their car, they looked smaller somehow. Not defeated. Just human. I stood in the doorway until they drove away. Then I closed the door gently. No shaking hands. No tears. Just a quiet inhale. Rufus pressed against my leg again, grounding me. The house felt the same. Safe. Whole. But something inside me had shifted. Not softer. Not harder. Balanced. For the first time, I had faced them without shrinking. Without apologizing for existing as myself. And I realized something powerful. Boundaries don't destroy families. They reveal them. Winter came early that year. The first frost settled over the lawn in thin silver sheets, turning the hedges brittle and bright in the morning light. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug warming my hands, watching my breath fog the glass. The house was quiet. Not empty. Not lonely. Quiet in the way a place feels when nothing inside it is fighting for space. 3 weeks after my parents visited, Marissa called. Not from an unknown number. From her own. I stared at it for a long time before answering. "Hello." Her voice wasn't sharp this time. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't wounded in the way she used to perform hurt. It was tired. "Hi." We sat in the silence for a few seconds. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," she said. That alone told me something had shifted. "I know," I replied. Another pause. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she admitted. "Changing the locks." "I know." She gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "You always looked like you would bend eventually." There it was. Not cruelty. Just truth. I used to, I said. She exhaled slowly. It's different now. At home. I imagined it. The tension redirected. The expectations no longer cushioned by me. I'm trying to figure things out, she continued. For myself. It was the first time she had ever said that sentence without attaching blame to it. I didn't rush to comfort her. Growth doesn't need applause. I hope you do, I said calmly. There was something fragile in the space between us, not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition. You don't hate me? She asked quietly. No, I answered honestly. But I won't save you. Silence. Then, softer. I know. And for the first time in our lives, that wasn't followed by anger. We ended the call without promises. Without dramatic declarations. Just a quiet, mutual understanding that whatever relationship we would have in the future would not look like the one we had before. And that was okay. Spring returned like it always does, unapologetic and certain. The hedges grew fuller. The paint on the porch railing was fresh. The living room walls were a different shade now, warm, light, chosen without negotiation. My life did not transform into something cinematic. There was no sudden romance sweeping me off my feet. No grand speech from my parents about regret. But something better happened. Stability. Marissa moved into a small apartment across town. She kept the job she found 6 months ago. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was hers. She called occasionally. Not to demand. To update. Our conversations were careful. Measured. Adult. My parents stopped using the word dramatic. They visited once, invited. They sat at my kitchen table and didn't comment on the furniture placement. They asked about my work. They listened. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't repaired overnight. But it was honest. And honesty is quieter than dysfunction. One evening, almost exactly a year after I changed the locks, I stood at the front door with a new set of keys in my hand. Not because I was replacing them. Because I was adding something. A keypad lock. One where I controlled the code. One where access could be granted intentionally and revoked intentionally. I installed it myself. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at the door. It wasn't about keeping people out anymore. It was about knowing I could. That's the difference. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks you control. And that house, the modest white one with the uneven hedges and the warm spring light, no longer felt like something I had to defend. It felt like something I had chosen. I chose peace. I chose clarity. I chose myself. And the quiet that followed wasn't heavy. It was earned.